Hi, this is Sunny Bailey from Fairhaven Wealth. There have been quite a few articles in the newspapers recently about what you need to save for a comfortable or even a no-frills retirement. A lot of this has come out of a recent Westpac Massey University report by Dr. Claire Matthews, and it's interesting and thought-provoking. Some of the headline conclusions include that, so for example, for a two-person household to have a no-frills retirement in a metro area, it's indicating that you don't need to save anything. Um, in a provincial area, you'll need to, but if you want one with choices in your retirement, then you're going to have to save over $400,000 to have that sort of retirement. Now, I think this sort of research is useful. The report itself is quite interesting, and this is what it looks like. And it does go into a fair amount of detail in terms of how these figures are derived, all of the expenditure guidelines, etc. There's a few things that I still can't get my head around. I don't know what assumptions it makes, for example, in relation to home ownership or not. Does that 400,000 assume that you own your own home? I'm not really 100% sure about that one. In any case, it's thought-provoking, and I guess the other thing that I would be concerned about is that everybody's circumstances, needs, and objectives are different. It's almost like saying that you need $100,000 household income to live a choices lifestyle, but what that represents to different people can be really different. And it's certainly the case that every household is different in terms of how much it spends and how much they want to spend. So it's ultimately what you need to retire on is much more personal than you can get from any headline figure in a report or a newspaper article. So I'm going to go through a few resources online that are quite handy just to at least give some thought to what you might need when you retire. The first tool that I often go to is the sorted.org.nz. They've got a retirement planner. And what you can do is you can work out how close is retirement, how, in particular, how much you want to spend in your retirement. So what I tend to do is I tend to nominate exactly 65 years ago. So what I'm doing here is I'm just assuming that retirement is today. So I'll be turning 65 this month if I was born in July 1952 at the time of recording this podcast. I can add a partner, and let's say my partner also turns 65 and that we're looking to retire right now. Want to work out how much we want to plan for. So let's say I'm a male, my wife's a female. Let's just turn it to, so my life expectancy as a male at 65 is 91 years, which actually isn't too bad, but that also does mean that 50% of people will live longer than 91. Let's just put it to 95 for both, so that makes it a nice, easy round figure of 30 years in retirement. How much will we need? You can nominate either a weekly, fortnightly, monthly, yearly figure. Let's make that an annual figure of, say, $80,000. We ask where that money will come from. We can include the New Zealand super or otherwise, and I think it's an interesting exercise, especially if you're younger, to look at the two scenarios, including and not including. So we're assuming that both my wife and I are receiving New Zealand super, and let's just forget what our current KiwiSaver balances are or anything else. Let's just look at from scratch how much we would need in investment assets to live on $80,000 a year. So we go across to here, and currently we're on track to have $31,000 per year, which is the New Zealand super figure. And what the bottom line figure really is that assuming we're getting New Zealand super, the amount that we would need is $1,034,820 by the time we hit 65 to enable that sort of retirement lifestyle over the course of 30 years. If we don't include New Zealand Super, that figure actually goes up quite substantially, almost $1.7 million. So, especially for someone who's fairly young like me, where there's really no certainty about whether we will be getting, whether New Zealand Super will be available in the future, or what it will look like, how much it will be, whether it will be means tested, for example. There's a fair amount of variability and that right from the get-go. I like the sorted website simply because it's nice and straightforward, and it's tailored to New Zealanders, so it automatically includes the New Zealand Super. One of the shortcomings of this is that it gives you a really specific figure, and I can understand why it would do that, but that is not how reality actually works. If my wife and I were retiring right now and we had this exact amount in our account, it is not a given that that will see us through to 95. It may, and it may see us for longer, or it may enable us to have an even better lifestyle than 80,000 a year, but it may not. And that would be especially the case, for example, if there was a substantial market downturn or correction that, without us doing anything, reduced our savings by 20% or something in any given year, especially in the early years of our retirement. And a great way of demonstrating this is another retirement calculator, which I think is fantastic. It's a bit wordy, but what you'll see very quickly is that it demonstrates something that a lot of these retirement planners that try to give you certainty doesn't. So let's say that we're looking at spending of $80,000 a year, and let's assume that we don't get any New Zealand Super. So we'll go with that figure of 1.7 million. Let me have a look. 1.7 million. And again, let's look over a period of 30 years. Now, what FireCalc does is it looks at historical market returns back from the late 19th century, and it applies the actual returns and forecasts them forward. So what we'll see here is if we hit submit, it will give us a set of scenarios. Now, that looks a bit confusing, but every single one of those lines represents a real historical scenario for, say, a couple that retires with that size portfolio, with that same expenditure. And you can see how different the outcomes are. So here we can see that in one of those scenarios, after 30 years, that couple ended up with $8.5 million. But we can also see this red line here being the zero figure. And 25 of the 117 scenarios, they went below the zero figure. Some before 20 years are up, some a lot closer to the 30-year period. Now, I think this is a really good way of demonstrating that there's just no certainty around these figures. A 78.6% success rate, which means that of those 117 historical scenarios, 78.6 were successful. That's usually pretty good. A 100% success rate would probably indicate that you're spending far too little over the course of your retirement, and probably leaving a larger inheritance for your children than you might want, depending on your priorities. So that's something that's really worth noting. FireCalc is a retirement calculator that uses your real historical returns. You can go into even more detail within these tabs. You can look at what you might receive from the New Zealand Super. It's US based, so you do have to translate some of the figures here. You can look at spending models. So in each of these scenarios, we've assumed a constant expenditure over the course of retirement. Although in reality, expenditure for most retirees is kind of U-shaped. You'll often spend more soon after you retire than you do once you hit your late 70s, for example, when you might not have the energy or health or interest in traveling. You start living perhaps a more modest lifestyle, even if you've got the resources, because spending huge amounts of money doesn't give you the same amount of joy as it might do when you're just out of retirement and you want to travel, or you want to buy a new car, or you want to do the renovations around the house, or do those things that you can finally do now that you've got the time and the kids are away and you've got your health to do it. Um, the U shape indicates that once people start becoming particularly vulnerable and having health issues near the end of life, then expenditure can increase substantially as well. So here you can change the model of how you might spend your money over the course of your life. It also assumes a portfolio of 75% equities, 25% defensive assets, and again, you can change that just to model what different portfolios would result in. You can even investigate scenarios. So, assuming you've got a 75 a $1.7 million portfolio, what spending level would give you a 95% probability, or whatever probability you want, that you would be successful with all of those historical scenarios. So what we can see here is if you wanted a 95% success rate as opposed to the 78 that we had before, you'd need to spend 67,500 or so in order to have that level of confidence. So that's a historical test. Another way is doing Monte Carlo analysis, and that's arguably more forward-looking. What it does is it looks at different asset classes and assumes that they will return according to a normal distribution. So stocks might have a normal distribution of, say, a 7% return and a standard deviation of 10% or so. And what that does is, based on the portfolio, is it will run a number of different scenarios and try to determine how many of those scenarios you'll be successful in retirement or not. So it's not back testing, but in some ways it's trying to make a forecast extrapolating from what you can from the nature of the investment. And again, the assumption of normal distribution is I'm not entirely confident in that, but it's another good exercise to do along with the others to see what degree of certainty you want when you retire. So let's say we're looking for 30 years again, portfolio balance of 1.7 million, wanting to spend $800,000 per year. So again, very similar to the other scenarios. And this runs 5,000 simulations. It's a Vanguard nest egg retirement calculator. And it says that with this portfolio of 20% stocks, 50% bond, 30% cash, which is really very conservative, a scenario, the portfolio will survive 30 years and just under 2/3 of scenarios. If we change that to perhaps something a bit more aggressive, like 20, 30, 50%, let's make it 40% stocks, 30 bonds, 30 cash. And we rerun the simulation. So everything else is the same, but this weighting changes a little bit. And the figure improves to 78%. So actually very consistent with the back test or the historical testing from the fire calc option. What we're seeing here is that there's different ways of working out how much you need, and the factors aren't just how long you want to retire for, what your portfolio is and how much you want to spend, but it's also what degree of certainty you want in your retirement, because anyone who gives you certainty is probably revealing more about themselves than they are about the future, and that's one of the factors that you need to really consider. There are other factors, including to what degree you want to leave an inheritance for people or for causes that you care about, and how important that is relative to other things such as the level of expenditure you want to have in retirement and the level of confidence that you will have when you get there. So it's not straightforward, and it does evolve over time. And it's also the case that when you do retire, your returns are going to follow that that interesting sort of scenario. Um, so you need to calibrate that over time to work out how much you maybe can afford to spend or want to spend in order to continue having that comfortable retirement. I hope you found that useful. I guess the one thing I want to stress there is that how much you need in retirement isn't something that you can outsource to anyone else or to an external report. It's deeply personal. There are uncertainties and there are ambiguities about what the future may hold in terms of investment returns, what your expenses will be, what your health will be, etc. But you also need to take a look at what you personally want to achieve. What sort of lifestyle do you want to have in retirement? What sort of lifestyle are you used to? What do you define as a no-frills lifestyle? And what do you define as a lifestyle that has the choices that you want? Extrapolating from that, you'll need to work out what sort of income you want, what sort of portfolio generating returns that you'll want to have, and also what degree of certainty do you want. As we could see from the fire calc example, the returns that you generate can really vary substantially, and we've got no control over the market. As with any financial plan, you need to model it based on your circumstances, your needs, your objectives, and you really can't control what the market does. As I've said previously, anyone who provides certainty or thinks that they can tell you what the future will hold is revealing more about themselves than what the future will in fact hold. So it's personal. There's lots of ways of thinking about it and modeling it, and I recommend doing all of those things and coming back to a response that's personal to you, thinking about all those variables. What sort of lifestyle do you want? What sort of portfolio will you need, and can you realistically achieve? And what degree of certainty? There are other factors as well in terms of how important it is for you to provide inheritance for your children, and also what your expectations are in terms of expenditure. Is it going to be constant, or is it the case that you're going to budget for specific expenses near the start of your retirement and then expect a lower amount? And certainly once you reach retirement age, it's something that you will need to calibrate over time based on the returns and based on your actual lifestyle and the cost of that and your circumstances such as your health. As you can gather, it's multifaceted, and sometimes it really is worth having a independent person to bounce ideas about, to chat about, and that's something that I absolutely can do through my business, Fairhaven Wealth. Check it out, fairhavenwealth.co.nz. If you want to get a feel for the ethos behind it, check out my personal blog, New Zealand Wealth and Risk, www.wealthandrisk.nz. Thanks.